So hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second round of presentations we have this afternoon. In case you have just joined us, my name is Mattia di Ubaldo. I'm a research fellow at UKTPO and at the University of Sussex Business School, and I will be chairing the next two sessions. In this session, we have a paper titled Identifying Emergent Supply Chain Logics During Disruptive Geopolitical Events, a study of Brexit, the US-China trade war, and COVID-19. This paper is by Sam Roscoe. He is Reader in Operations and Supply Chain Management at the University of Sussex Business School and a Fellow of the UK Policy Observatory. Sam has worked extensively on supply chain designs and recently on how firms adjust to major disruptions such as Brexit and COVID-19. Before getting started, please, as usual, post your questions in the Q&A and I will try to pass them to our speakers after the discussion. Now, without adding much further, I will give the floor to Sam for his talk. So please, Sam, you have about 19-20 minutes.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Mattia, for that great introduction. I'm just going to share my screen here. 1 second. I want to make sure that everybody can see that. Just give me the thumbs up. So I don't need to introduce myself because Mattia did such a great job there. But what I'm going to be talking to everybody about today is how supply chain designs and the logic behind supply chain designs are changing as a result of three primary disruptive events. We're going to be talking about Brexit, the US-China trade war, and COVID-19, and trying to understand how some of the geopolitical tensions that have arisen because of those events are beginning to change and transform global supply chains. So one of the things that we were looking at in this study, it was between myself and some researchers at the University of Cranfield, as well as North Carolina in the US. And we were trying to understand, what is the logic behind supply chain designs? Why do companies design supply chains in a particular way? And we came up with this definition here of supply chain logics representing what we call a constrained system of reasoning and thinking that supply chain executives employ to navigate an uncertain global operating environment. And we argue, and I will argue throughout this presentation, that this logic of supply chain design is shaped by institutional pressures. Okay, so these are pressures from governments, stakeholders, shareholders, customers, suppliers. Logic is also shaped by perceived severity around supply chain disruption risks and the relative mobility of suppliers and supply chain assets. So I'll talk a lot about that as we go through the presentation. So to sort of preface this, if we look at why we are where we are today, we have these big global supply chains spread out all over the world. And what I would argue is that a lot of this has been very path dependent. Companies began moving overseas in the 60s and the 70s in pursuit of low cost labor. Trade barriers began to fall. We had trading relationships being set up between nation states. Companies were able to move their production and their suppliers into emerging markets, in particular China, Southeast Asia, and set up manufacturing footprints in those countries. Over time, the cost of labor has risen in those countries, and companies have begun moving to other locations, such as Vietnam, Malaysia, even places in North Africa, and all around the world to sort of in this pursuit of what they call efficiency or minimizing costs. So the sort of the spread of global supply chains over the past 30 or 40 years has been primarily around a drive for efficiency and lowering the cost of supply chain operations. So the supply chains have essentially been treated by companies as a cost center that needs to be managed. And I'm going to try and argue that logic behind supply chain design is beginning to change. So if we look at some of these different sorts of disruption risks in supply chains. So for example, since 2016, there's been a sort of a profound shift that's been going on in the world. If you look at, the protectionism, the nationalism around Brexit, you also had the election of President Trump in the US, the start of the US-China trade war. And then if that wasn't bad enough, then COVID-19 came along and there was a lot of other sort of geopolitical tensions that came around with that. So we're in the middle of what the Independent is called, and many news sources have called, a supply chain crisis. And this supply chain crisis is threatening to derail the UK economic recovery in terms of GDP, as well as the world economic recovery. We talk about supply chain crisis in the US. You can't offload your containers off of ships. There's bottlenecks in terms of trucking, there's labor shortages, there's all sorts of things that are going around in terms of leading to sort of shortages on store shelves. And the idea of supply chains has really gained prominence over the past, well, in particular over the past year, but over the past 4 or 5 years as well. So when we talk about, the US, the sort of Brexit, we have these labor shortages. We keep hearing about, fuel shortages, driver shortages. We can't get things onto store shelves. We also have, the US-China trade war that has led to a number of companies. This article here by Forbes argues between 40 and 50 companies have been moving production out of China into other places. And unfortunately, they didn't move production back to the US as President Trump hoped, but they moved their production facilities to nearby locations such as Vietnam and Malaysia in order to avoid the tariffs that were being imposed due to the US-China trade war. We also have, the geopolitical tensions that have arisen because of COVID. You have nation states that have been restricting the export of pharmaceutical products. You also have vaccine nationalism. You have countries that are beginning to sort of protect exports in order to make sure that their own population has vaccines and pharmaceutical products to treat the symptoms of COVID-19. So what we were trying to understand then is why do managers look to redesign their supply chains in a particular way during these compounding geopolitical disruptions? So we had Brexit, then you have the US-China trade war, and now you have COVID-19 on top. So it's not just one big event, it's 3 events and possibly more to come that are being layered on top of each other. And what we did is we went out into industry and we began to conduct interviews. We conducted 40 interviews from November 2019, actually before the pandemic started. We were looking at Brexit and the US-China trade war. And as the interviews were going forward, then we began to hear about this mysterious virus that was coming out of China. So then we turned our attention to begin to focus on COVID. So we went out and we interviewed 3 automotive supply chain executives. We interviewed people in the chemical industry, the clothing industry, the FMCG industry, heavy engineering, oil and gas, and pharmaceuticals. So one sort of the key thing that we found is why were companies begin to move their production around? And there was an overall sort of sentiment that they were under a lot of what we call institutional pressures from governments. So in particular, in the pharmaceutical industry, there was pressure for pharmaceutical companies during Brexit to hold a minimum of 6 weeks of stock of pharmaceutical products so that there weren't shortages in the event of a no-deal Brexit. So pharmaceutical companies were beginning to build up stocks of pharmaceutical products. We also saw a lot of government pressure being exerted on heavy engineering companies. So as well, they had to make sure that they had enough rolling stock to cover 3 months within their industry to make sure that there was enough equipment to make sure that the tracks were maintained and that the equipment was maintained. And they felt that they had to hold that stock. We also saw pharmaceutical companies, again, in the US, they were beginning to set up production facilities in the US because of pressure from the US government to localize production for critical drugs. So when we looked at these pressures across these various industries, we began to see sort of some clustering around industry. So for example, government pressures, you can see there at the top, the auto industry complained a lot about sort of government interference in markets in terms of building up stock and making sure that they could keep their just-in-time supply chain running. We also saw the oil and gas industry having to hold additional stock to make sure that they were able to deliver their products to market. Pharmaceuticals, like I mentioned. The heavy engineering sector, like I mentioned before, so this is rail and the rail network. So where we saw there was customer pressures in that industry, but their primary customer is National Rail or the UK government. So again, there was pressures from the government to begin to build up more stock in their supply chain. So the other factor that really came across during these interviews when we were coding these interviews was this what we call perceptions of supply chain risk. So we argue here is that not all risk is equal, and a lot of people that we spoke with perceived the threat of Brexit or perceived the threat of the US-China trade war more severely than other companies did. And the companies that really perceived that threat to be quite severe, so for example, pharmaceuticals again, they proactively began to invest money and set up new facilities in Europe in order to avoid border delays because of Brexit. We also saw companies such as in the technology industry, they began to invest heavily in in electronic data interchange, as well as visibility in their supply chain, so they can monitor what was going on in their supply chains. So these companies perceived disruption risk to be quite high. But then we saw sort of other industries such as oil and gas and heavy engineering that didn't have the same perceived disruption risks. So they didn't take as dramatic action as we saw in some other industries. So we began to sort of look at this across different industries and again, look for sort of clustering. And you can see here the fast moving consumer goods industry. When we spoke to them about Brexit, there was a lot of concerns about customs and tariff risks. And they were very concerned about, because they were using just-in-time supply chains to bring products into the UK grocery sector. We also saw in the manufacturing sector, again, running just-in-time supply chains, very concerned about customs and tariff risks. And FMCG being worried about border delays, you can see here. Other things that we began to look at, how do we see different sort of types of supply chain designs emerging? And we actually found, just to quickly summarize, we found about 8 different types of supply chain designs that were emerging over the past 3 or 4 years. So the first and foremost, we found a lot of companies actually, instead of beginning to invest in new supply chain infrastructure, what they tried to do is go out and navigate the policy environment. So basically they went out and they tried to speak with policymakers to say this idea of Brexit is going to have a huge impact on our industry. Pharmaceuticals, auto, aerospace, a lot of the companies went to the UK government and said, if we continue to do this, especially if there's a no-deal Brexit, it's going to have a huge impact on our industries. We saw after, back in hindsight, several years on, that those petitions to governments were largely ignored, especially from the business community. So what was interesting about that, though, is they tried in the first instance, before making investments, was to influence policymakers. We saw the same thing in the US, where the electronics sector and the technology sector, they were actually petitioning the US government to lower tariffs on different types of steel and aluminum. However, the US government largely ignored what they had to say. But what they did try and do is they tried to set up free ports, and they tried to set up customs clearance areas within the US to try and get around those types of things. We also saw this move to what we call an almost home supply chain logic. So the idea here is if companies began to move out of China, they did begin to move their production facilities. They looked at this nearshoring idea. So some companies, but not all, began to look at setting up new production facilities in places like Mexico, as well as Poland for Europe, Mexico for the US, and Vietnam to send stuff back into China as a result of the tariffs that came in because of the US-China trade war. The other thing that we saw was in some industries, this close to the customer type of logic. So these industries, especially in pharma and in the technology sector, they were really pushing to have production located within local markets for local customers. Again, that was really driven by government pressure. Government saying that, oh, because of COVID, you need to locate your pharmaceutical manufacturing here in the UK or in the US. So a lot of the big companies that we spoke to, GSK, AstraZeneca, and Pfizer as well, were looking to set up their own facilities closer to their key markets to make sure that they were, first of all, compliant with regulation, that they were doing what the government had asked them to do, but to make sure that they were also responsive in the event of supply chain disruptions. Some of the other logics that we saw were what we call tactical warfare. So a lot of companies, instead of making huge investments in nearshoring and onshoring, what they did instead is they began to build up buffer stock in their supply chain. So in the lead up to Brexit, obviously companies were holding 6 months plus worth of stock. This created all sorts of delays. If everybody remembers back at Felixstowe, where they couldn't offload containers in the run up to Brexit because of this huge influx of stock in the lead up to the end of 2020 and leaving from the European Union. So there was a big buildup of stock in the UK that we saw. And the other interesting thing that we came across as well was a lot of companies who really did want to move production, especially move production out of China because of the tariffs, couldn't. Okay, so we had a lot of companies, especially in the automotive sector, who were physically unable to move production. And in those types of instances, there's this example here that you can say from the VP of Merchandising and Operations Support at Auto 3. What this individual said is the supply chain for brake parts and brake rotor manufacturing moved to China 30 years ago. There's only 3 brake rotor manufacturers in the entire world, and all of these are located in one Chinese province. and they produce 80% of the world's demand. It would take too long and be too expensive to move the suppliers out of those locations. And this is despite a 20% tariff on steel and aluminum. So these companies said, the actual cost of picking up our suppliers or even our manufacturing facilities is just cost prohibitive. It can't be done. So they had to do what we call this grin and bear it type of logic. And then finally, we had some companies, but not all, who moved into this ready for every scenario. And these types of companies, they saw a high degree of institutional pressure, a high degree of perceived supply chain risk, and also a very sort of mobile type of supply chain. So in these types of scenarios, these companies set up very, very technologically savvy companies. They set up tracking and tracing systems, electronic data interchange systems. So they had better visibility of their supply chain. So then what we tried to do is sort of understand, well, how do all of these scenarios fit together? And you can see here on, hopefully this is the right way for you guys, on that axis, the sources of institutional pressure. When institutional pressure was high, you can see here that, and the perceived severity of a supply chain disruption risk was relatively low. These companies just focused on maintaining access to the market. When the institutional pressures were perceived to be low and the supply chain disruption risk was perceived to be low, these companies, first of all, went out and navigated the policy environment. They tried to influence policymakers. However, we saw as the perceptions of disruption risk began to increase, a lot of companies began to think about, well, I need to now nearshore my production. Or if the institutional pressures were even higher, such as in the pharmaceutical industry and from government, these companies had to bring production closer to the consumer. Now, along the bottom axis here, the Z-axis, we also looked at the difficulty of moving, the immobility of suppliers. So you can see here with high institutional pressures, as well as these perceptions of supply chain disruption risk, that a lot of companies just had to, especially in the automotive sector, just had to grin and bear it. They couldn't do anything because they couldn't move their suppliers. So just skipping ahead here, what we then looked at is, well, how can these logics be clustered? And what we saw then is heavy engineering was very focused on, navigating the policy environment. They were also, when they couldn't get the response from government that they wanted, they began to go into to this preventative maintenance. They tried to maintain market access as much as possible. Other industries, like I mentioned, pharmaceuticals, looked to nearshore production. You can see here that the technology market, we saw quite a few technology companies in our sample move production nearshore, so Mexico, to bring it into the US, bring products into the US. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the automotive sector was one of the few sectors that we really found clustered in this grin and bear it area, because they all were using the same motor manufacturers who were all stuck or fixed in China. So just to sort of summarize this, because I know I don't have a lot of time, is the argument that we're trying to make here is that the underpinning logic of global supply chain design is changing, moving away from a predominant focus on cost and efficiency towards a consideration of geopolitical pressures, minimization of disruption risk, and flexibility in supply chain responsiveness. Our argument then is companies can no longer afford to solely focus on cost and efficiency in their supply chains as institutional pressures are increasing and geopolitical disruptions are multiplying. So again, Brexit, US-China trade war, COVID-19, first wave, second wave, third wave, who knows how far that's going to go. We also found that intense government pressure and persistent geopolitical disruption risks appear to impact firms in the same industry, resulting in similar types of supply chain design responses. However, we did find that a dominant supply chain logic only emerges under conditions where suppliers are fixed in a particular region. So again, the automotive sector was one of the few sectors that we found that was unable to move their production because their suppliers were fixed in one geographical location. Companies in some industries may want to alter their supply chain designs, but they can't, again, because their suppliers are fixed and clustered in a particular area. And finally, that we found, that our findings suggest that there's significant shifts in the supply chain logics will occur over time. Like I said, so companies started off by trying to influence policymakers, then they moved to preventative maintenance, and then they moved to building up stock. And then some companies went even further and began to relocate production back home. So we found that these logics change based on, the institutional environment, as well as on the perceptions of risk or disruption risk in the market. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that there because I know I don't have a lot of more time. So I will wrap it up there. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. You were spot on with the time. So great on that point. And thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. It provides almost real-time information on how firms adjust to these disruption, all the heterogeneity there is across the various activity. I think this is really invaluable information for policy making. Now, before opening the floor to the questions from the audience, we have a discussion, and this will be by Sam Lowe. Sam is a senior research fellow at the Centre for European Reform, a visiting senior research fellow at the Policy Institute, King's College London, and a co-founder of the UK Trade Forum. Sam, you have about 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'll try and keep it well below 10 minutes to allow other people to come in. Just to clarify, can you hear and see me okay?
All good.
Okay, good. So I found this a very fascinating paper largely because it relates to a very timely and pertinent issue, and there were certain elements to it I recognized from just my own discussions with companies. I remember a couple of years into the Brexit process discussing with the supply chain team of one major supermarket what their plans were, and they were very much in the grin and bear it phase, where the line was, well, we're not doing very much to prepare, but we think all of our competitors will suffer the same, and it won't damage our business necessarily. And then I spoke to them a year later, and they were sort of in panic stations trying to stockpile, find new suppliers and the like. So it's interesting that these things change over time. I suppose the question I would have, and I suppose this is maybe something for future study, is how much some of these reactions are dependent on the magnitude and longevity of a shock. Because if we look at the different scenarios, the cumulative scenarios that have been taken into account here, so you have Brexit, you have China, you have COVID. Brexit is arguably a small, in the grand scheme of things, shock, but it's a long one. It's a structural change to the relationship between the UK and the EU, so it's not going away. But then you look at COVID, and it's maybe medium shock. I mean, this is the thing, even COVID-19, if you think about how supply chains have fared, I'm not sure it's been a huge shock, weirdly, in that I think supply chains have fared fairly well. We're struggling a little bit now because of the mismatches of supply and demand, but it also feels like it's potentially going to be a short shock, in that the supply chains, I think, will work themselves out. And then on the China one, it's sort of unclear as to the magnitude, and also unclear as to the longevity, because a lot of it was at the whim of a president that was very unpredictable. And I just wonder how, and I suppose this fits into the point too in terms of perceptions of risk, how that feeds in to the decisions taken, and whether that would be possible to measure in some way. As in, if you increase the magnitude and you increase the longevity, does that change what people think? And I suppose one potential avenue for exploration there is climate change induced shocks to supply chain, in that you can presume, going on sort of existing climate modeling, that they're going to be quite severe and they're going to last for a very long time. And then my second, I suppose, question is, do you think it's possible to try and discover what magnitude of incentive you would need or institutional pressure to break a dominant supply chain logic? So how much money would you actually need to offer the semiconductor industry to diversify out of Taiwan? Or how much money would you need to offer industry companies to get them to look for sources of rare earths outside of China? And I'm not sure if that's an easy question to answer, but it's certainly one I'd be quite interested in.
Okay, yeah, great questions. I think on the first point, that's a really interesting one, because there was actually a study by Deloitte last year when COVID first hit. They looked at something like 250 supply chain executives who around, I think it was about 70% of them said at the onset of COVID that they were looking to relocate their supply chain closer to home. And then they did the same survey in October of last year, and that number dropped to about 20%. Because, you know, if we remember the fall last year, people were like, okay, well, China's reopened, the ships are moving again, air cargo is back on, everything is looking pretty good. You know, maybe this was a blip and we'll just manage it. However, what I would argue now, though, is a year on, especially this year, is arguably even worse than last year in terms of the ongoing delays, especially in transport around shipping, trucking, air freight, and ongoing port closures in China, has really beginning to see, and I almost after a year and a half, 2 years, where companies are really beginning to question these long globalized supply chains. And my sort of personal feeling, and this is not based on the initial data because that was done last year, but my personal feeling is now, after this long persistent ramifications of COVID, is that companies are really beginning to look at more regionalized and localized types of supply chains in order that they can begin to move production capacity between facilities if there's a shutdown in one country, or if there's, you know, delays at container ports in the US or in the UK. So I think that it does take a long time for companies really to begin to think, well, this is actually, you know, our services are suffering, our costs are going through the roof, and we now do need to begin to reconsider how we're designing our supply chains. But if you look at it, it took the US-China trade war, it took COVID and several months of COVID for companies to really begin to question this. So I do think it takes a big shock and persistent shock for companies to begin to rethink what they're doing. On your second question, I wish I had the answer to that. I'd probably be a very wealthy person consulting for the government. I think that's an interesting one. We are seeing, if you use the semiconductors example, and Joe Biden, his new supply chain review is actually offering incentives to begin to set up semiconductor production in the US. And that is working. You know, there are companies that are actively, Intel is a good example, that's actively looking to set up semiconductor production in the States. And that is based on tax incentives and subsidies from the government. So I don't know the exact amount and what is the breaking point to make that happen, but I think if there is enough political will, then that can happen if the tax incentives are there and the subsidies are there for that production to be relocated. I think the interesting one, though, is what would be interesting to see is these automotive companies, for example, you know, 20% tariffs weren't enough, 25% tariffs on aluminum weren't enough. When does it get to a point where you're like, this is crazy, I can no longer afford to source from China, I have to set up my own supplier somewhere else? My personal feeling is probably more around 30 to 40% type of tariffs, because those particular suppliers were so embedded where they were.
Great. Thanks to both Sam and Sam. These are great points and definitely very informative. We have a few questions coming through the Q&A, so I'll just pass them maybe 2 or 3 at a time to you. The first one is about how can governments and industry work together to increase visibility of supply chains, because there might not be, many may only know about one whole, each way. And then there's a question by Michael Gazarek about the role of competitors. To what extent did you find that different supply chain logics are influenced by firms' perception of what the competitors are doing? Mm-hmm. And then we have another question about, well, you mentioned that different businesses use different logics at different points in time. Is it possible that different pieces of logic might be used simultaneously? Is this also a possibility? Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and absorb that. I think the one about the governments and industry working together is really interesting, and I know that there is a lot of sort of effort underway. The Department of International Trade and BEIS is really trying to work with UK industry to diversify supply chains, to look at to having more diversity on where supplies are coming from. So I think the UK government is taking quite a different approach from the US government. The US government is more about localization, bringing supply to the US, having this sort of more protectionist type of attitude. The UK, from what I'm seeing, is probably a little bit more about, okay, well, you need more diversity in supply. Don't source everything from China. Don't source everything from one location. Spread out your sourcing. In terms of visibility, I think that is primarily driven, if we talk about supply chain visibility, and to me, that means technology, technologies such as enterprise resource planning, SAP systems, blockchain. It's the technology that allows you to sort of see across the supply chain to know where your suppliers are located. That is primarily driven by businesses, but I do think that the government has a role to maybe try and incentivize businesses to be doing that more, so that they're able to businesses have that sort of investment. And that could be done through some of the, the high value catapult center network in the UK. It could be done through other sort of funding schemes to encourage businesses to have better visibility in the supply chain. The one thing that we did notice is the companies that did go for this sort of ready for every scenario logic, they were the most flexible. Okay, so they were the ones who were able to move production capacity between facilities. They could see a disruption. They could know how they can model it. They use things what are called digital twins, so they could see what was happening in their supply chain and then move it to another location. And that gave them the most flexibility out of any of those models. And my argument there is as your visibility increases, your use of technology increases in the supply chain, the more flexible that a company can become. And I think the government could play a very active role in supporting that. On the other question, I think one from Michael there. Yeah, this is interesting about supply chain logics being affected by perceptions of competitors. And I think that's really important. And I would argue the whole reason why we're in this mess is because back in the 70s and 80s, there was, a couple of companies began setting up their production in low wage economies. And that was in very, high labor types of industries, such as apparel and clothing and garments. But a lot of other companies said, well, if everybody else is doing it, we should be doing it as well. So you saw semiconductors, you saw high value technology type of companies who began setting up manufacturing in low wage economies, even though labor is only a fraction of their supply chain. So this sort of competitive pressures actually force this global movement towards low wage economies. And I think what we'll probably see now as more sort of leading companies began to set up regional supply chains, which is what I expect to see, is that you will have this sort of competitive pressure for other companies to follow suit. So you're going to have these first movers. The automotive sector is already heavily involved in regional supply chains. Tesla's a good example of this. Ford and even GM. But you're also seeing other industries, so apparel and electronics are moving into more regional supply chains. So I think there will be a lot of competitive pressure to begin to sort of shrink those global supply chains into more sort of regionally located supply chains. The last,
right,
see if I can see the last.
Simultaneous supply chain logics. Have you seen
definitely. So I think it was interesting to really chart, especially with Brexit and the US-China trade war, is the majority of companies first went to try and influence policymakers. Don't input this tariff on my commodities. Let's not go for a no deal Brexit. It's going to be a disaster for our industry. Unfortunately, businesses were largely ignored during Brexit, and as well as during the US-China trade war, the tariffs were imposed anyway. And then when companies began to realize that, they then had to make those investment decisions. So we saw a movement away from sort of influencing policymakers more to actually, okay, well, we have to do something now. And they began to make those investments. That was primarily large firms. Small and medium-sized enterprises couldn't do much because they didn't have the spare resources in order to make those investments. So I think basically what we saw is sort of a movement between these different logics over time as either the event became nearer or as the nature of the event changed. So again, with COVID, at first, everybody's like, okay, we need to move everything back home. And then as the time went on, people began to think, well, is that really the best decision? Does that give us the most flexibility? So the nature of supply chain design as the context or as the institutional context began to change as well. And as governments, began, or especially in the US, are putting more and more pressure on companies to relocate products back home, then you are seeing companies doing that. But in the UK, where that pressure is not intense, you have a lot of other companies who are carrying on business as usual. So there's a lot of nuances in the response. And that's what I was trying to say before, is there's no sort of single industry doing one thing. It's different sort of thing, different supply chain designs going on in particular industries. And it's only really this dominant logic when you have these fixed suppliers or fixed supply chain assets.
Great. Yeah, no, that's very clear, Sam. Thank you. All right, we have another couple of minutes until we break. If there's no other questions, I might just ask you one myself, just out of almost self-interest. I saw one on the perceived disruption risk. You put up this chart, and something caught my eye. Seems to be very few firms list compliance as a risk, whereas many seem to have listed the lack of regulatory alignment. I was wondering, what is compliance in your, what's intended? Is this something that meaning that you have to show compliance? So how does it relate to the regulatory alignment?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I think definitely when we were talking about regulatory alignment, that was particularly in the pharmaceutical sector, particularly because as a result of Brexit, they had new regulators, the MHRA in the UK, as well as the European Medicine Agency in Europe. The regulatory regimes changed as a direct result of Brexit. So they were very worried about regulatory alignment between those two bodies, and they had to make sure that they were compliant with the UK regulator as well as with the EU regulator. So for me, regulatory compliance is actually part of that regulatory alignment type of risk that they perceived. So I actually had compliance sort of bundled up within that regulatory alignment type of area.
Okay, all right, thanks, Sam. Yeah, very clear. All right, we have another 2 minutes before a break. If there's not a question, I would have another one myself. Sorry, I found this very interesting, especially the grade you put up at the end, is three-dimensional grade where you sort of categorize the various supply chain logics. And perhaps this sounds a bit provocative, but I wonder how long is it, or for how long is that grade valid? I mean, is the exercise of categorizing the various responses something which, definitely we would believe that classification today, but wouldn't firms over time just try to adjust to this different pressures and risks, and so at some point you would see that structure collapsing sort of to one corner?
Well, I think, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think what we try to stress there is we have to be honest. These are interviewees' perceptions of risk, and it's interviewees' perceptions of pressure being applied. So those categories will hold, but the way that people and companies respond to those pressures and risks will change. So we might not be able to you might have, logic sort of combining or changing, but the perceptions of where those sit in that grid should remain constant. And what you would see again is you're probably going to see companies moving between those logics, and those logics changing as a result of perceptions of risk and pressure.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sam. Yeah, I think that we are sort of nearly out of time now. So I would thank again Sam for his very interesting presentation and Sam Lowe for the discussion. I guess you will find both Sams now over the 4 or 5 minutes of comfort break we have on Wonder for further questions or just catching up. So I think we will see you here again at 3:30, so in 5 minutes exactly, for the next presentation. Thank you very much.